Hey everyone, welcome to CPC 21. We are so glad that you are here. My name is Melissa J. MacDonald, and on behalf of the board of directors, we just are so grateful that you're here with us online. Obviously, we wish we could be together in person, but how special to be able to access this from where we're at and still take part of what God's doing. I'm going to talk to you today about leading with influence. This idea of how do we lead up? How do we position where God has placed us, and how do we serve? So we're gonna dive into that. I've got my notes here, and I'm really looking forward to what God's gonna have to say to us. So just take a minute and prepare your heart for what God might want to say to you in the next few minutes. All right, leading with influence. What does that look like? What does that even mean? I think often when we're in children's ministry, we feel like we're not all that influential. So we know that kids love us, right? We know that. But how do we actually contribute to the overall vision of the church? How do we earn a seat at the table? How do we actually influence more than just children's ministry? Because that's really important. I have yet to meet anyone in children's ministry who doesn't also have a heart for other ministries, who doesn't care about the rest of the church. What I have discovered through the years is that children's ministry leaders are often some of the most aware of the big picture. So let's talk a little bit about it. When I was preparing for this, I began to think, who do I know that's influential? Like, what does that mean? And one of the things I always like to look back at is, what do we know about Jesus? Because I feel like we can always learn from him. So I want to take you in, and we're going to look at a few things. I want you to think about the Gospels. First of all, when we think about the Gospels, we really get to understand who Jesus is and his heart and how he did ministry. And a couple points I want to make. Jesus is such a great influencer, and we want to learn from him. Before we get right into that, though, I want to remind you of this. Who you are speaks louder than anything you say. So let me say that again. Who you are speaks louder than anything that you say. So often we think that in order to have influence, that means we have to be talking. That means we have to be loud. Our voice has to be heard. And character matters, you guys. Who you are matters a whole lot more than what you say. So back to Jesus and how he led. Let's think about it for a minute in the Gospels. One of the things I love about Jesus is that he spoke up when he needed to. He wasn't afraid to speak up. Now, if you've done any work on the Enneagram like I have, I'm an 8, you guys. I'm an 8, which means I'm a little mean. I can be a little forceful. I like to make things happen. And so 8s are really driven. And what I love when I look at how Jesus does ministries, he's not afraid to speak up. He's not afraid to say what needs to be said. He leads with influence. Jesus also withdrew when he needed to. So when we think about influence, I like to think of it as we want to be really well-rounded. We want this to be just not, I have influence at work, but that we are men and women of influence. So that means we have to be well-rounded. So Jesus spoke up when he needed to. He also withdrew. And those feel really like a juxtaposition, right? So you're like, wait, what? But Jesus, at the height of his ministry, when he could have been doing the biggest stuff, that was usually when he withdrew. That was usually when he was like, I need a break. Leading with influence often means that we have to step back and take a break when we know that we need it. So Jesus withdraws when he needs to. And I can imagine it drove some of his disciples crazy. Can you imagine they're kind of like on the sidelines going, you could be huge. You could be so big. There's so much more we could do. We could up your influencer. Like, you could be big. And then they watch him withdraw and they're like, that's not exactly part of our social media influencer plan. And yet Jesus knew exactly what he needed to do. He withdrew when he needed to. So he speaks up when he needs to, he withdraws when he needs to. The other thing that Jesus does is he would notice those that others would tend to overlook. What's so interesting when we think about influencer, we think about, they're the people who are making things happen, and they're hanging with the big people, and they're doing the big things, and yet we have this Jesus, the Savior of the world, who spends time with prostitutes, who spends time with people who have bleeding disorders, who hangs out with people that everyone else would be like, ew, not going there. And yet, Jesus spends time with them. He sees them. I was telling the story of when Jesus is healing, and he's in this house, and all of a sudden, this paralyzed man is lowered through the roof. And I'm telling the story to teenagers, and I'm like, just imagine what's going on. So often we only look at, oh, the guy was paralyzed, now he's fine. But what was going on here? Jesus was making a point. But what I love about who Jesus is he doesn't go, okay, oh good, you're here, I'm gonna use you. He goes, hey, let me tell you about who I am. And he takes these opportunities and these moments to teach lessons when we would think that's not the right time. Leading with influence often means that we're speaking messages, we're living out messages in places that other people wouldn't necessarily. So when you think about leading with influence, would you start first from a posture of how did Jesus lead? And I think you'll find that Jesus leads so different than what we think of leadership today. Over and over again, Jesus does surprising things. Over and over again, he's using his influence in ways that just confound other people. So when we lead with influence, often people will ask me, I was asked to do this breakout. I'm delighted to do it. I don't know if that means I lead with influence or if I've made a lot of mistakes and not gained a lot of influence. I'm not sure. But I love this idea because one of the things people will ask me a lot is, well, how did you get there? How did you get there? So they'll go, well, how did you gain influence? And I'm always like, I don't really even know how to answer that because God did it. So I don't even know how to answer it. I work with a lot of college students and they want to know, well, Mel, I hope at some point I can do what you do. I hope I can travel around and speak. How did you do that? And I'm like, I don't know. It just started to happen and it took time. It didn't happen quickly. So let me say this about gaining influence. When I say gain, I really mean it. You do gain influence. You aren't instantly given it. Influence is earned. It's not a right. It doesn't come just because you have a job title or just because you think you should. I meet far too many young leaders who think, this is my job. I should be listened to. I should have influence. And whether you're young or you're older doesn't really matter. You still have to earn the right. You have to earn influence. It is earned. It's not a right. And I would say this too, you have to get over feeling like it's your right. Because when you only focus on the fact that I should be heard, this should be influencing, you get cocky. You also forget to focus on what really matters. And that's making sure you are a person worthy of influence. So how do you gain influence? You don't. You gotta earn it. And then you gain it. It doesn't instantly happen like that. Influence comes with time. It really, really does. And this is probably the hardest thing personally for me to remember is things take time. I remember being in college and I remember my professors telling me, when you go into your church for the first time, you need to just not change anything for that first year. And I thought that was just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Because I'm kind of like, let's come in and blow the place apart, let's start new. Well, they were wise and they were right. And if you know, right? You don't come in and change everything. It takes time. So influence takes time. It's not going to happen instantaneously. You might get the job title, and with that job title, you have a sense of authority. And so with that authority, you might have some influence, but in order to actually have influence that matters, it takes time. Also, keeping your influence takes time. So it takes time, and it's honestly, I'm gonna just tell you right now, it's gonna be slower than you want it to be. And there are gonna be times you're frustrated. Women, it's gonna feel like it takes even longer. That's because it does. A lot of times it just takes longer. It's worth it though, to wait, but it takes time. Influence often has to do with how we use our voice too. It's how we use our voice. Influence is not just about being the loudest person in the room. It's about using the voice that God's given us and doing it at the right time and doing it wisely. So let me talk a little bit about your voice. I get asked this a lot too. Again, I think I'm asked to talk about voice because I'm loud and I have a lot of words, possibly. But I really delight in using what God's given me and using it wisely. So when it comes to your voice, and you're not gonna like this, you're just not. Okay, if you're like me at all, you're not gonna like hearing this. In order to have your voice be heard, you have to be quiet first. right? That's not fun to hear. If you're like me, you're like, but I have so much good stuff to say. I have so much. But our job is not to just keep talking. So in order to have your voice heard, you have to first be quiet. I took a job at a denomination about 11, 12 years ago now. And I was in my 20s. I was the first ever female at this type of director level role. And I stepped into the first leadership meeting. And I realized that not only was I the only woman, I was younger by about 20 years minimum of the other leaders around me. And I learned pretty quickly, and I had been through enough ministry experiences, enough life experiences to realize it's best for me just to be quiet and listen first. So I spent about a year just getting to know the team I was on. I was quiet. In fact, they teased me afterwards because they would say, we thought you were quiet. We thought you were shy. Well, I wasn't quiet or shy. I was getting to know them. I was earning the right to have my voice heard. And so it takes time. And I had to be quiet. There were times they would talk about things and it would well up in me what I wanted to say. And I found that if I just waited, especially waited until I was asked, it was heard so much better. So oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, all the time, if you want your voice to be heard, you're probably gonna need to be quiet, which makes no sense. I know that. I know that's like, what? But what you're doing is you're getting to know people. You're learning what's going on. And again, you're earning that influence, and that's really important. Continuing to talk about voice, continuing to talk about leading with influence. So I'm on this team, good team, really good men, really good. Had nothing of any consequence going on to do with kids ministry, and my job was to talk about that. My job was to influence that. And so I'm looking around at this team going, they have no idea. And they didn't care, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They cared about their ministries. They cared about their job. You know, we're helping lead a denomination for basically the world, and so they care about their part. So I'm like, well, how do I get them to care? And what I thought it meant, I really did, was I'll just talk about it more. Well, no, that actually just makes me annoying. So I got to know these men. I got to know them. I spent time with them. I listened to them. And I'll be honest, there were times I was bored. There were times I didn't understand. There were times that I really needed a Starbucks. But I got to listen to them. What happened as a result of that was I genuinely respected them. And you cannot fabricate respect. You can try. But I genuinely respected these men, and they could tell. They ended up becoming like grandpas to me in a lot of ways. Almost every single one of them either came to our wedding when my husband and I got married or sent a gift. Like, it was just, we're family by then, but I genuinely respected them. And with that, because they knew I respected them, I earned respect from them. So that we could actually, a year later, we could sit at the same table and actually have discussion. And I could argue, and I could be the loud one. I could be the one that just was like, that's a dumb idea. But I'd earned it. I showed genuine respect for them, genuine. And I also understood their ministries. So when I began to talk about what I wanted to talk about, I didn't just talk about only my thing. I started to show them where it tied in, where it fit. And they went, oh my word, I never thought of that. So you've got to just respect. You've got to spend time learning. You've got to be quiet sometimes. I call this leading up. I call this leading with influence, leading up in children's ministry, in any sort of volunteer role. And when you're not the head honcho, when you're not the number one, we have an opportunity to lead. And oftentimes we're leading up. What that doesn't look like is that you sit down with your lead pastor and say, I need to tell you a few things. A few things you're not doing great. I just want to let you know about a few things that aren't really going well. That's not what it means. What this means is that you begin to do the work that God's calling you to do, understanding that you have influence. That's what leading with influence is. You begin to realize, well, I do have some influence. So let me give a story of this. I'm at this national role, and one of the things that is just innate within me is to lead within a team. I always love having a team around me. Part of that is because I'm really strong in some areas and I'm really weak in other areas. I don't have like a good mix of, well, I can do everything. I can't. I'm real good here, real bad here. So for a team, I need people around me who can pick up where I am not good and who want to work with me. And I love working in a team because we're doing something together. So that was my MO. So I come onto this national team and I realized that nobody works in a team. Like, it's called a team, but we're all doing our own separate things. And so I said, well, why don't we put teams together? And they're like, no. Now, quite honestly, I wanted to fight for it. I wanted to sit down and go, you guys, you're so wrong. You need to just try it. And then God really began to convict my heart, and I began to realize that this wasn't, again, about me being noisy. This was about me leading the way He was calling me to lead. Here's the deal. Leading with influence means you lead with integrity in what God's called you to lead without forcing it on anyone else. That's influential. You lead the way God's called you to lead. You don't force it on someone else. So I began to lead. I put teams together. And all of a sudden, I realized we want to think that leadership trickles down, and it does, but leadership started to trickle up. And all of a sudden, after a big conference, they came back to me and said, how did you do that? Tell us about your team. And I'm like, oh, the team that I talked to you about that we should have done. No, I didn't. I'm like, let me tell you about my team. A couple of years went on, we had the same national conference. Guess what? They had teams. Suddenly, a team mentality began to start. And I'm not here to say, oh, it was all because of me. But when we lead with influence, people notice. And they begin to go, oh, do you see that? So I want to ask you a couple questions. What would it look like? What would it look like if you decided right now to lead your area to the best of your ability? What would that mean for you? What would that look like for you? And this is what I want you to think about. What you're trying to do here is you are not trying to lead anyone else. So, and what I mean by that is you don't have an ulterior motive. So you're not going, well, I'm just going to do over here the good work and hopefully everyone will notice. Nope. You have to have clear motives. I'm going to lead where God's called me to lead. I'm the children's pastor. I'm the children's ministry leader, volunteer, whatever. I am going to lead where God has placed me to the best of my ability with no other agenda. What would that look like? I hope you wrote that down, and I hope you really think about that, because that's a big thing for us to consider. I really think it would change the way you do ministry. I really do. Because suddenly you aren't necessarily so worried about what's going on around here. You're going, I'm going to lead to the best of my ability right here. Now, if you're like me, and I do find that children's ministry leaders, you guys, I don't want to be biased, but I am. We're the best. We just are. Okay? 2020, 2021, nobody knows how to pivot like we do. And I keep telling lead pastors this. I'm like, you guys, children's ministry is where it's at. We know how to pivot because Johnny's puking on the carpet. Susie just ate lactose and she shouldn't. We know what it means to adjust on the fly. So we know how to do this. So children's ministry leaders, you guys were strong. And like I said at the beginning, I've never met somebody who isn't aware of the other ministries around us. Make sure that in your awareness of the other ministries, you're becoming a champion for them instead of being critical of them. Instead of looking, going, they're not doing that right. If they would just do what I told them, if they would implement my spreadsheets, if they would do that, if the pastor would preach shorter. Make sure you're becoming a champion of them, because I know you have a heart for the whole church. I know that. But sometimes that heart and our desire to lead can come across manipulative. It can come across, I think, really stronger than we mean it to. So what would it mean for you to recognize that God's at work in all the ministries? We know we're in the best ministry. Like, we know that. But what would it look like for us to look and support, champion and cheer, but stay in our lane? And what I mean by stay in our lane, that's not a negative thing. That's a, God, you called me to this. I am going to do an amazing job where you've called me right here, because that is what matters. Leaders, influential leaders especially, we kick amazing goals. We do amazing things in the ministries God's called us to. And other people begin to go, look at that. I often used to think, I wonder if I spent less time criticizing and looking at other ministries, I wonder how much more we'd get done in our ministry. I wonder what that would be like. Have you ever wondered that? If not, think about it. Other question I have for you, what if you led with health and purpose? What if you led with health and purpose? I will be honest with you, I have been in full-time ministry since 2003, okay? So we're at, 17, 18 years. And I have spent the majority of my ministry years in pretty unhealthy environments. I know when I say that, you can relate. I know you're sitting there right now going, yes, right here. So what I've learned though, because here's the thing, you either become better for that or you just become bitter and you quit ministry. And so what I've learned is a lot of what not to do. So pretty early on in ministry, I burned out at age about 24, completely burned out. You guys like crawled under my desk at church and started crying and didn't come out. Like I was done. I worked for a pretty manipulative pastor who's very narcissistic, a little abusive as well, physically, spiritually, not physically, no, thank goodness, but verbally. It was a really tough thing. I went and I got some counseling and started to work through that, and I realized I don't want to do that again. So I began to put boundaries up. And not like, oh, nobody can come near me, but I began to create some health in my own life. And go, you know what, that pastor, I was working 80 hours a week and it still wasn't enough. I don't think I'm about that life anymore. I don't think I'm gonna do that. And I went to my next church and I had some good boundaries up in place to make sure I was taking care of myself. Those boundaries have not always been appreciated through the years. But once again, if we're gonna be influential, we don't worry about what everyone else thinks. We go, okay, God, what are you calling me to do? So for years now, I've had boundaries up. I've made decisions, and I have been made fun of at times. I have been given a hard time. So one of the things that really brings me joy, you guys, if you've heard me speak before, we've met, I used to travel a lot. Up until the pandemic hit, I traveled a lot, 150 days a year. And then suddenly, I'm not traveling anymore. Well, I would travel, and one of the things I realized was I had to make sure I was doing good self-care. And I could get exhausted traveling, because anyone would, right? So things that would bring me joy, and this is gonna sound silly, but would be convertibles, okay? So I'd fly to Florida, I'd fly to California, Arizona, somewhere fun, somewhere warm, typically in the winter months, because I live in Iowa. And I would fly, and usually I could rent a convertible for less than what my regular rental car would be. So I'd rent that car. I would have the most fun. Put the top down, play music, I'd sing loud. I'd go, if I'm in California, I'd go to the beach for a few minutes. So I'm on this whirlwind trip, right? But I have these few moments where I can take out and go, I'm gonna do something that's refreshing. I'm gonna do something that brings me joy. Well, I used to get made fun of. I really did. And kind of like ridiculed a little, like, oh, how are you spending the Lord's money? Why are you doing that? And I quickly learned to go, not my business. Really not their business, but not something I need to own. And I began to put up these things, boundaries, and create space within me. Things that would make sure I was healthy. Because when you burn out at 24, you realize, I don't want to do that again. And I'm 24 and I've got a good long life left to go. If I don't create some space, if I don't take care of myself, nobody else is going to. So I lead with influence by just being healthy. Let me just encourage you on this. So often we want our volunteers to be healthy, and yet we're not actually living lives that we're calling them to live. So we're saying to them, you need to be in your Bible. Are you in your Bible? You need to be doing this. Are you doing that? If you want you're gonna need to write this down, so get a pen, okay? If you want your volunteers to be healthy, you have to be healthy. Because if you're a leader who leads with influence, you're calling people to something. And if you're calling them to health, that comes because you're healthy. I have a guy I work with right now, and he's quite a bit older than me. He could be my dad, and we're good friends, and we were on the phone yesterday, and he's telling me, I'm going on sabbatical, I'm taking 3 months. I'm like, really? Yeah. And he goes, you know what? Mel, I can be a workaholic. I'm like, preach that, so can I. And he goes, I can be really tied to my phone. I'm like, And he goes, so I'm gonna spend 3 months. I'm gonna put my phone away. I mean, he's not putting it away. But he goes, I'm not gonna be tied to it. I'm gonna spend time with my wife. We're gonna do some counseling. We're gonna do some things together. And I gotta tell you what that did for me was I just took a deep breath and was like, yes, that's how it should be. That's how it should be. That guy leads a whole team of pastors in 5 different states. And what he is doing is modeling for them what health looks like. It's one thing for us to yak about what health looks like. It's another thing for us to live it out in front of people. So he's living this health out in front of us. I delight in that. So I want you to think about that. What if you were to lead with health and purpose? What would change? Don't pay lip service to something that you're not actually doing in your life. Don't say, well, my kids and my husband are my number one priority. And then ministry becomes your number one priority in the way you spend your time and your energy. What would happen? What if you just led with health? What would that look like? One of the things through the years as I've realized God has really given me a position of influence is I've purposed to be very verbal about how I take care of myself, about how I connect with God. Because I realize there's so much out there that tells us run faster, do more, be busier, and very little out there that's saying, hey, take care of yourself. Hey, take a break. Hey, when's the last time you did this? So I'm verbal about it. Early on, probably 8 years ago, I started taking retreats. I'd go away for a few days, about 3 times a year. And I'd post about it on social media. I'd let my teams know, I'm gonna go do some retreat time. I did that not because I wanted people to think, oh, she's so special. She's so cool. I wanted them to know that I prioritize that. And you know what happens? Because I led with influence, I could then ask them to do it as well. And I could show them a way to do it and go, this is what I do. Would you consider doing it? So what if you led with health? What would that look like? Before you think about leading the people around you, how do you lead yourself? How do you tune your ear to what the Holy Spirit's calling you to do? And you lead with health. Here's what I do know happens. When we begin to lead healthy lives, it catches. It catches. People are drawn to it. They're like, I want to try that. I want to see that. It catches. So might we think of influential as something that other people can catch? Because they're like, I shouldn't say catch, right? No, I really shouldn't. Not in the season we're all in. But influence catches. So what do you do? Last section here. What do you do when you have influence? What do you do? So you've got influence. And I'll be really honest with you. I think there's nothing scarier than having influence. It scares me. I also think it should. I think I should have a really healthy respect for it. I say all the time that, I speak all over to all different ages. I prepare more for speaking to kids than I do for adults because I have major influence over those kids. The adults, their brains have developed enough. They can go back and double check my work. They can do their own research. They can go, I'm not sure. They know how to be skeptical. When I have 200 kids sitting in front of me at a camp, they are glued to me and they're absorbing everything I say. I feel it so heavy. I take it so seriously. And scripturally we know, this is huge. We don't want to cause one of them to be led astray. We don't want to have a millstone tied around our neck. So I take it seriously. So when you have influence, I want to encourage you to take it seriously. A few years ago, I was in a meeting with the president of our denomination, and we were just kind of chatting, and I was at a point where I was just done. And what I mean by that is I was tired of the sound of my own voice. I was tired of having influence. I didn't want it anymore. And so I'm just done. And so I'm asking him, I said, do you ever just want to be done? Do you ever just wish you didn't have a position of influence, a voice of influence? And he looked at me in the kindest way possible. And he admonished me. basically he said to me, whether you want it or not, you have it. Because what I had been doing, and what was so interesting is that same day I had 2 other people say just about the same thing to me. And what I realized is that I had been spending so much time trying to push off the influence I had because I didn't feel worthy of it, that I was actually doing detrimental work. So I go, oh, it's not about me, it's not about me. And finally he was like, Mel, for such a time as this, you've been called to lead, and you need to lead. And I was like, whoa. And then 2 more people said it, and I was like, I feel like maybe I should pay attention to this. And so I did. And I began to step into it. But because I took it so seriously, and because I began to really kind of feel nervous about it, and like, oh, who am I? And actually he told me, he said, Mel, if you wanted this job, we wouldn't want you. Because we want people in this job who have a healthy understanding of the weight of it. So take it seriously. If God's given you influence, take it seriously. Do not take it lightly. When you take it seriously, you have to think through everything. I can't tell you the amount of time I spend thinking about what I'm gonna post on social media. Gone are the days that I'm like, here's a picture of my cereal. I think about it. When my husband and I started dating, he's behind the camera, say hi. Oh, he can't hear me, his headphones in, but he's over there. When we started dating, I thought all the time, okay, how do I introduce him to people? What is this gonna look like? How much do I share? How much do I not share? Because I knew I had influence. And whether I wanted it or not, I had it. So I better do good work with it. So you lead with influence, and you do it, you take it seriously. Make sure it doesn't feel like too heavy of a weight, because we're never meant to carry a heavy weight, remember? We're totally supposed to give that to God. But make sure you take it seriously. Once you have influence as well, I want you to really think creatively, and I want you to think purposefully, what kind of mark do you want to leave? If you work with kids, which you're at Children's Pastors Conference online, CPC 21, you work with kids. Kids are wet cement. You cannot encounter a kid and not leave an imprint on them. That's just who they are. They're wet cement. I am always thinking through, what kind of imprint do I want to leave? All the time, thinking through that. So when you lead with influence, I want you to think about that. What kind of mark do you want to leave? A lot of you know my story. You know that I spent most of my adult life, up until about 5 years ago, dying, being told I was dying, being really, really sick. And I will say that when you find out early that you're dying or supposed to die, because spoiler alert, I'm still here. When you find that out, you really begin to think through things. And so I kind of feel like sometimes I have like this 85-year-old perspective on life because I've thought through. Even to the point where I used to tell my boss, because it was very serious. A number of times I was told like, this is it, and then I was fine. I always felt like I probably wasn't my time to go, and I was right. But I would sit down with my boss, I'd be like, look, if I happen to die in the next month, here's what you need to know. And he would you please stop saying that? But the thing was, I thought about it. I want it to be intentional. So that's where my heart comes from, is what do you want your mark to be? What kind of mark do you want to leave? If you're leading with influence, what do you want that mark to be? And you guys, I could do an entire seminar on some of this. Couple things that I want to give you that have been important for me has been to think through, do I want to make sure that my influence, the mark I leave, is kids that look to me to find Christ? Sounds good, right? Think about it though. Do I want to grow a generation of disciples of Melissa J. MacDonald or disciples of Christ? I'm here to tell you, I want nothing to do with me. I hope my legacy, I really do, I hope my legacy is kids who know Jesus and love him and serve him the rest of their lives. And I hope they can't even remember where it started. I pray all the time that that I am forgettable and he is memorable. But that means some intentionality, pointing to him. Another thing that I want when I think about what kind of mark do I want to leave, I mean this honestly, because I've thought a lot about this. I hope my life is marked by leaders who go further than I do. I hope I have this picture. First of all, I have 6 knee surgeries, 2 knee replacements. You guys know I'm usually at CPC on crutches or in my scooter. I am on my feet with no crutches right now. Praise the Lord. But when your knees don't work, you think about running and you're like, nah. In my mind, I picture this. The group, the leaders that I've poured into, the leaders that, I don't know, have influenced in some way. So many leaders are like, oh, I read this, thank you. And I'm like, what? I've never even met you. I hope that they run ahead of me. And I'm behind, not just because my knees don't work, but because they have taken it and gone. I want to be in the back going, cheering them on and saying, go, 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 you can do this. So what kind of mark do you want to leave? Is the mark you're going to leave just about what color you paint the nursery walls? Or is it about that one young mom who brings her baby to church? Doesn't really have a home life, doesn't feel loved. And you look away from your painted walls and you look at her and you say, hey, I'm glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. Tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you want your mark to be? If you're leading with influence, you think about that stuff. Because influence doesn't mean we're just loud. It means we think through, what are we loud about? What are we talking about? So think through that. What do you want your mark to be? Lastly, what are the most important things? If you're gonna have influence, you gotta use it wisely. It's kind of, like, I don't know, most of you probably live about where I do, middle age. No, not middle age. I'm not middle age yet. Please say that's not so. Middle, what's that called? Were you? Anyways, you don't make a ton of money, okay? So we're just run of the mill. And what's interesting about that is we understand money. We think about money. Some months we worry about money. And then there's people who win the lottery and suddenly they have all this money and they're trying to decide what to do with it. Because it's not just about, oh good, I can pay the bills this month. It's, I could buy that place. I could do that. And they have to think through it. I want you to think about like that. You've got influence. What's the most important thing? When you've got influence, you have to think about, what's the most important thing for me to be talking about? What's the most important thing for me to be doing? The phrase I use with my own self in 100 different ways, but especially in this, is just because I can doesn't mean I should. Just because I can doesn't mean I should. Just because I can speak up about that doesn't mean I need to. Just because I do have an opinion about that doesn't mean it needs to be heard. Just because I can run the sound booth doesn't mean I need to be doing it. So I think through that all the time. What should I be doing? The side note to that is, if you aren't doing what you should be doing, you might be taking the place of something or someone that should be doing it. Sometimes when we as leaders try to do everything and influence everything, we get in the way of how God wants to use another person. So what are the most important things? Not everything is the most important thing. And you're like, but no, this is really important. If that is for you, then do it, go for it. But you don't need to be passionate about everything. You don't need to fight for everything. What's the most important thing? What matters the most? Today, as I was preparing for this, and I was sitting down and looking through my Bible and reading through some notes, one of our neighbors has COVID right now, and we've got some friends that have COVID, and I thought, what's the most important thing? I feel ready for this. I've got a couple of things I could be doing. I thought, you know what, I'm gonna put together some gift baskets for them. And so I wrapped up, and our one neighbor, she has a little 2-year-old. They don't go to church, they don't know. And I gave them the Jesus Storybook Bible, some chocolate for mom. She's a single mama, nurse here in town. And I ran it over and put it on their doorstep. I didn't run, because I don't run. And then I have another basket of things that we're gonna go leave at somebody's door. Because you know what? I could sit in my home and I could plan all the things I wanna say about leading with influence. Or I could get off of my chair and go serve the town I live in and go love the people I know. Leading with influence is thinking through, what's the most important thing? And it's tuning your ear. God, what do you want me to care about? What do you want me to have influence in? I want to leave you with this verse. 2 Corinthians 6:6. Actually, I'm going to grab my Bible for this because there's a couple verses here. 2 Corinthians 6:6. I sit in 2 Corinthians a lot. 2 Corinthians 4 is probably my favorite chapter in the Bible. Read it, you'll understand why, as someone who's been sick for many years. 2 Corinthians 6 says this, 6:6 says this, we prove ourselves by our purity, by our understanding, our patience, our kindness, by the Holy Spirit within us, and by our sincere love. We faithfully preach the truth. Goes on to verse 8. We serve God whether people honor us or despise us, whether they slander us or praise us, despise us. Oh, we are honest, but they call us imposters. We are ignored even though we are well known. And then you go back and you look back at verse 6. We prove ourselves by our understanding, our patience, our kindness. And then in verse 10 it says our hearts ache, but we are always filled with joy. We are poor, but we give spiritual riches to others. We own nothing, and yet we have everything. To me, that's a picture of what influence looks like. So I just want to encourage you, especially in this weird year that we've been having and that we're having. It's hard to feel like we have influence. It feels lonely. It feels like we're not heard. Would you maybe stop talking so much? And would you pause and go, God, what do you want to do in me? And would you begin to look at what you could do right here, right within your sphere of influence? Because if you don't do the good work here, why would God trust you with more? So would you do that? Would you take courage? Would you take heart knowing that God sees you, He knows you, He loves you? And would you take heart in knowing that you're valued? You are already influential. So may you lead well as you have influence. Guys, thank you so much for being on with me today. I really appreciate it. I am in the chat. Come and hang out with me. If you have any questions or any thoughts, let me know. Thank you.